So Eckhart learned some things from these Beguines, and he uses his scholastic philosophical training to coin a set of terms, set of concepts, which are really striking. And I think you can sum up all of Eckhart's teaching in three major concepts. The first is the birth of God. The second is letting be. And the third is breakthrough. So I'll say something really brief about these three, and then we'll read some passages of Eckhart together. So the birth of God. Now, what does that mean? Obviously, Mary gives birth to God in Jerusalem. Literally, she is the Theotokos. She is the God bearer. She gives birth to Christ, and Christ is God, or the Son of God, who is identical with God. And so the God birth happens in this moment. But for Eckhart, the logic of non-duality requires us to not just revere this moment and adore Mary as though it's something that happened 2,000 years ago, or in his case, 1,200 years ago to some special person somewhere else, but rather it happens in every Christian soul. Wherever there is a Christian who realizes their Christianity, God is born in them, literally. So he'll say, there's nothing about Mary, nothing so special about Mary that I can't affirm of myself. He'll say scandalous things like that. And his argument is that there's only one ground of being, and it's God, the infinite ground of being. And this ground of being is the ground of all things, including me. So if Christ is born out of the ground of God in Mary, and that ground is not different from my ground, then Christ can also, and is also, and must also be born out of my ground. Somehow I must become Mary. I must give birth to Christ. Of course, we can think about this in a imitatio Christi way. I have to become a second Christ for my time. But Eckhart pushes it even further. His argument is that when God becomes man in Christ, let's move to the second concept then, okay?
Yep.
Letting be, not the Beatles song, but Gelassenheit. That's the word that Eckhart uses. Gelassenheit, which is an untranslatable German word, which if you were to translate it, it would mean letting be-ness. It's an adjective. So the quality of living in such a way as letting things be. And the point of this concept is to stop pretending that you are the agent of your own divinization, to stop pretending that you need to do something, to get off your own case in a certain way, stop pretending that you're some kind of major obstacle to the Christ event occurring in your life, and recognize that it is always already occurring or occurred, and it occurs through the activity, the infinite activity, the invincible power of God. All you've got to do is stop doing what you usually do, or get out of your own way. Drop your big spiritual program, your fasts and your morning meditations, insofar as they are being understood as a necessary means for you to achieve something that you don't already have. Stop all this and just let God be God in you. So that's the second concept. And the third concept is called breakthrough. He uses this phrase often in the sermons, Durchbruch. And breakthrough, you could say it's sort of like Christian enlightenment, Christian realization, because when the Christian breaks through to the truth, they don't arrive at a new place. They arrive at where they already always were, only they understand where they are now. So the breakthrough is when the veils drop from our eyes, and when we understand correctly that the infinite and the finite are not two, that infinity is not distant from us, that Christ's nature is not something that happens in Jesus and not in me, but rather I'm included in this. It is my essence. It is so my essence. Christ's nature is so my essence that I really am nothing outside of it. There's no me to be affirmed outside of the Christ event. I am entirely Christ's, and Christ is entirely me. So the breakthrough is when the Christian finally understands this.
Well, this sounds very much like Jung's experience in the Red Book. He's experiencing being Christ on the cross and identifying with this story, and saying to be a Christian today is not to follow Christ; it's to become Christ, to realize that you are Christ.
Do you think that Jung really was a non-dual thinker in the sense that we've described it?
Yeah, from how I understand it, yes. But what's your sense?
I feel like he was divided. And, when he's in the depth of his most creative work and his active imagination and his research into religion and Gnosticism and the psychology of individuation, he certainly becomes non-dual in his expression. But with his other side, his scientific side, he always somehow spoils it. He says, "Oh, this is just psychology," or he'll say, "We know we're just speaking about empirically scientific facts and not about metaphysics."
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean, but this is also Jung's persona, and I think he held on to that in his public presentations and in his books and such to a certain extent until the end of his life. But if we ask if he was a non-dualist or if he experienced Christian faith in a non-dualistic way, I think, yeah, that was his experience, but maybe he didn't have the courage to maybe fully sort of express that.
Yes, I think that's what I'm trying to say. I don't feel, it feels as though the scientist Jung and the depth psychologist, archetypal psychologist Jung are somehow dualistically opposed to each other. And I always feel that science gets the upper hand. Science always wins.
How do you mean?
Well, for example, in his readings of alchemy, he is so quick to say that what the alchemists were discussing was really just psychology, only they confused things. They confused it with natural science. And now we all know, of course, that such things as the alchemists described don't occur, in a natural scientific context. They occur only within the soul. Or even his synchronicity essay, where he tries to somewhat painfully quantifiably demonstrate astrology. And the whole thing goes astray because we're not talking about something that could ever be. We're talking about phenomena that demonstrate the relativity of quantifiable science. We're talking about the metaphysical. And insofar as Jung always puts a wall between his work and metaphysics, he never really gets to where Eckhart is. That's my view. I know we have to clue up here, but I have a few passages from this one sermon. People can look it up if they like. It's sermon number 6. It's only 3 pages. And I've taken the passages out from a good translation, and I've altered the translation somewhat. And you'll see all these themes in his preaching, the themes of birth of God, letting be, and breakthrough. So Eckhart says, not only has God become man in Jesus, he's taken human nature upon himself. Now that doesn't sound so radical. It's not just that God becomes the man Jesus, but all of human nature is taken into him or assimilated into him, which means that all of human nature is divinized through Christ. And this is what allows Eckhart to universalize the Christ event so that it occurs everywhere, always, and in every case. And so he'll say things like, this is the next citation, all the worth of the humanity of the saints, or Mary, the mother of God, or even Christ himself, is mine too in my human nature. It's all mine. It's not outside of me. So we revere Mary for her role in the incarnation, and rightly so we should, for her saying yes to the Holy Spirit and bearing the God-man. But all that perfection in Mary, all that sanctity in Mary is mine in my human nature, which has been taken up into Christ. So there's nothing in the saints that's not in me. There's no holiness or perfection outside of me, which is not also mine as well. There's no distinction between my humanity and the humanity of the saints. Another quote, there in the inmost core of the soul, where God begets his son, human nature also takes root. This phrase, the core of the soul, is a translation of the ground of the soul. So there in the ground, in the divine ground, and there's only one divine ground. That's also a non-dual point. There can't be multiple grounds of being. There's only one ground of being. And this ground of being is the inmost ground of my own being, but it's also God's ground. It's the ground where God begets his son. In this innermost core of the soul, human nature is rooted. All of human nature is rooted in the infinite ground of God. And therefore, there's nothing to be achieved. There's nowhere to go. There's no program that is needed. There's nothing to really await. It's all already realized. However, we don't experience it. And this is the problem. We experience ourselves as outside of God, or we experience ourselves as fallen and imperfect and hindered in every way from realizing the unity that has been given to us in Christ. And so Eckhart's teaching to the cloister is that is to give them what we could call a non-method for realizing or breaking through to the ground of divinity. And the non-method involves disidentifying from all negations, all negativities, because there's no negation in God. There's nothing that God is not. There's no limitation in God. So insofar as you are identified with your limitations, with your negativities, you are disidentified with your divine ground. So disidentify with your negativities and you'll realize the divine ground. You'll break through. Stop acting as though your finitude is something real. It's nothing real. So, concretely spoken, the quirks of our personalities, our neurosis, if you want, our limitations as human beings, our mortality, the fact that we're not good at mathematics, whatever it is, all these knots, all these negatives by which we define ourselves. Stop identifying with those, because they are not what's most real in you. What's most real in you is the infinite ground of God out of which you live. So Eckhart says, you must get rid of all not, N-O-T. To the extent that not exists in you, you are imperfect. And if you would be perfect, you must get rid of it. End quote. So this is the kind of paradox that he loves, right? He's telling the cloister what they need to do in order to break through to divinity. And he's saying, oh, you've got to get rid of certain things. You've got to detach yourself. You've got to deny yourself certain things. Absolutely. And what is it that you need to get rid of? Nothingness. The not. You must get rid of nothing. He literally says that. You must get rid of nothing. You must deny yourself nothing. So he loves the paradox of that. It sounds like he's saying, do whatever you like. But he's not saying that. He's saying, stop identifying with the non-divine in you. And then you'll break through. Another quote, as sure as the Father, so single in nature, begets his Son, he begets him in the Spirit's innermost recess. And this is the interiority of the Spirit. Here God's ground is my ground, and my ground is God's ground. And here I live out of my own, as God lives out of his own. So we spoke of the single non-dual infinite ground of being, which is my ground and God's ground. But now we get that note of individuality that we were talking about. My ground is God's ground, and here I live out of my own. I am entirely myself. Eckhart is not saying that we should erase our individuality. He's saying rather that we should most deeply realize it as rooted in the ground and non-dually united with God, and to live out of your own, to be yourself, so that the Christian life doesn't become taking on something that's alien to you, some kind of moral code that's difficult, like a hair shirt or something like that. but rather to be more yourself, to be individuated if you want. I think this is exactly a point of connection with Jung. To be individuated means to live out of the divine ground. And when you do so, you can be spontaneous. You don't need moral rules. Everything you do will be somehow already right and true and proper. So Eckhart at this point uses one of his favorite metaphors, which is the metaphor of life. Life lives out of its own. Life does everything it does just to live. It doesn't have a reason or purpose outside of itself. It's not trying to reach towards something other than what it's already achieved. So do all that you do, he says, acting from the ground of the soul without a single why. Live without a why. And that means, Sister Patricia, who is fasting more than required because she thinks she needs to achieve something thereby. If you ask her, Sister Patricia, why do you fast? And she says, because I'm a miserable sinner and I'm trying to win the mercy or the grace of God through my action. She's living for a why. Or if you say, I give alms to the poor so that I will go to heaven, you're living for a why. You have a reason for what you're doing. And all of this is to live in a way that's in some kind of distorted relationship to the ground. Rather, live without a single why. And this changes everything. This changes your relationship to religion. And this, I think, is one of the most important quotes. So this is where Eckhart says to the cloister, stop pretending that your religious activities are so important.
And why should that Sister Patricia help the poor?
Because she doesn't need a reason to do it. She does it because she does it. For her not to do it would be for her not to be herself. It's absolutely spontaneous. She's living out of the font of justice itself, the font of goodness. You could say, oh, well, there's another person who just is selfishly maximizing and hoarding wealth and looking after themselves, and they're living without a why. But I'm not so sure. Eckhart would say, no, that's not living without a why. Living without a why is generous. Like it gives itself, like a living thing gives itself. So he says to the cloister, quote, if you think you get more out of God by means of spiritual practices, devotions, serene retreats, and solitude than you can by the fireplace or in the barn, then you might just as well think you could seize God, wrap a mantle around his head, and stick him under the table. So this, you can imagine how this would disturb them.
It's so expansive.
It is. He's not saying you shouldn't do spiritual practices. He's not saying you shouldn't have devotions or retreats, or you shouldn't work for the poor, to go to your example. But he's saying do it spontaneously, without a reason, and don't for a moment think that God or holiness resides in these practices and not, let's say, in the kitchen, where you're cooking for the community, or in the barn where you're cleaning up the animals. And if you think that God is found in church and not in the kitchen, you're turning God into an object. You wrap him up in a little cloth and you stick him under the table. He's a thing. He's an object that you possess. He's an object you possess because you can access him through special techniques. That's an object, right? But it's not we who have God, it's God who has us. It's not up to us to bring God close. It's God who has always brought us into him. Here's the last quote. We'll finish on this. I love this. This is where he goes to the life metaphor, the spontaneity of life, like a plant, like a sheep, like a thunderstorm. He says, if life were questioned 1,000 years and asked, why live? It would answer, I live only to live. Life lives out of its own ground. Therefore, it lives without why. Thus, if you ask a truthful person who acts from out of his ground, why do you do what you do? He could only answer, I do it because I do it. God asks only that you get out of his way and let him be God in you.